Hello again, it's Al Hepburn back with the final part of my video on continuous descent on final approach. Today we're going to be talking about unusual approaches. Rnav approaches with advisory vertical guidance have virtually become the standard in Canada. Traditional aids approaches are sufficiently rare that they can be called unusual. Just because they're used traditional aids doesn't mean that they're not subject to CDFA though, and indeed many have a CDFA table. We'll discuss these first. Then I'll address that question of what to do when you have to circle and no circling minimums are published. The remainder of this part will look at procedures with a blank or non-existent CDFA table. Here is an example of a traditional aids approach is the VOR DME approach to runway 09 at Gatineau. Note that the reference for slope information is not the runway threshold, it's the DME site. This is typical of traditional aids approaches. But why would you want to fly one of these approaches? At Gatineau, there's a perfectly good Rnav approach to runway 09. With lower LPV minimums? The answer has to be either because the examiner wants me to, because I've lost GPS, or because it's the only approach available to this runway. If the examiner is insistent, ask him why. If you've lost GPS, you will have to have DME aboard, because GPS will not be there to provide distance information. The only approaches to be considered will be straight-in VOR DME approaches. In Ontario, there are 5 of these left. There's one particularly evil example of the traditional aids approach being the only one available, the Localizer to 2.6 at Billy Bishop, which we'll look at later. Here, I'll assume that this is a recovery situation following loss of GPS. For the VOR DME approach, your lateral guidance must be taken from the VOR, so you will push CDI to show VLOC. Our normal 2 mile to the FAF top of descent would be too low due to that step down at Etker. So we'll go with the recommended 3,000 feet at 5.8 DME. So keep an eye on 2400 at 7 DME, 1300 at 11 DME, and 14.4 DME for the missed approach point. Here's my example of that other rarity, an airport with an Rnav approach to one runway only, but no circling minimums. Brampton is one of only 2 airports in Ontario where you encounter this situation. The other is my home field of Pembroke, where restricted airspace to the north precludes an approach to runway 17. But Brampton has another bizarre feature. Both airports have traditional aids approaches to the one instrument runway, and these procedures have circling minimums. At Burlington Air Park, which is to the south of Toronto's approaches, the only approach is an Rnav from the south, but it has circling minimums published. The solution seems simple. Publish circling minimums for Brampton Rnav 14 and Pembroke Rnav 35. In the meantime, yes, I'll use the NDB 35 circling minimums at Pembroke if I have to. I've asked NavCanada this question, but have received no reply. The other bizarre feature at Brampton, by the way, is that the circling minimums for the VOR DME are 100 feet lower than the straight-in minimums for the Rnav approach. Now we'll look at approaches where the CDFA table is either blank or non-existent. The first 3 reasons for that are pretty obvious. If you're flying an ILS or an Rnav approach to LPV minimums, you will have approved vertical guidance, so there's no need for CDFA information. If only circling minimums are published, the final approach will be visual, so CDFA information is not applicable. They don't have a CDFA table on US charts, but it's still nice to have the benefits of a stabilized approach. In all three of these cases, continuous descent techniques can still be beneficial. I'll discuss them later. That leaves us with those straight-in approaches for which NavCanada leaves the CDFA table blank, because the approach simply doesn't meet their criteria. There's nothing in the instrument rating flight test guide that says you only apply CDFA when the table is available. And just because the table is blank, don't give up on advisory vertical guidance. We'll look here at how you might handle these straight-in Canadian approaches with a blank table. Here's the Rnav 2-3 approach at Bromong, Quebec. The CDFA table is blank. If there's a step-down fix, it's there because of some obstruction, probably that 602-foot lighted tower. The step-down fix usually sets the gradient. We'll calculate the gradient in feet per mile based on the 425-foot threshold crossing height, minimums at Zovpu of 1,000 feet, and the distance between Zovpu and the runway of 1.5 miles. It works out at 383 feet per mile. That's above the 370 feet per mile limit established by NavCanada, so that's why the table is blank. I tried loading this approach in the air recently, and it said I'd get advisory vertical guidance. The advisory slope is probably determined this way. At least that's how it seems to be done in the States, and advisory vertical guidance is a Garmin-Jeppesen invention. We still need to calculate a top of descent. I'll use the next steeper easy math gradient of 400 feet per mile. Note that the distance to the FAF is 1.5 plus 3.5 equals 5 miles, so I'll shoot for a top of descent around 7. It works out at 3,200 GSL at 7 miles. The slope at Elvis, which is 11 miles back from runway 23, works out at 48.25. So we'd be looking at a 2-stage descent, given that 5,000 foot minimum safe altitude. We'd have 1,800 feet to lose in about 4 miles on the transition. Moving the top of descent back a mile cuts us to 1,400 feet, which gives a less aggressive initial descent. So our top of descent will be 8 miles back from runway 23 at 3,600 GSL. If we get advisory vertical guidance, we will intercept the 383 feet per mile slope a little early. If not, start down 8 miles and use 400 feet per mile. The crossing height for MAC-VL works out at 24.25, and for Zovpu it's 10.25. We'll note these down in case we need them, but the key numbers are the step-down minimums of 2,200 and 1,000 feet. Here's the Rnav 3-4 at Marathon, Ontario. Again, the CDFA table is blank, and it looks like a repeat of the last slide. But when we do the calculations, we find it's not too steep, so it must not meet some other criterion. Loading this one on my aircraft, it again said we'd get advisory vertical guidance, so we just need to calculate our top of descent. Normally, I'd use the next steeper easy math gradient for this, but in this case, we're only looking at 7 feet per mile difference, so 3 miles per 1,000 feet will be good enough to calculate the top of descent. It works out at 3,100 feet, so we can get by with a single stage descent. Assuming we get advisory vertical guidance, it will probably cross lev up right at minimums. Without it, we may just require a little back pressure if you're being really pedantic. ILS and LPV approaches are approaches with vertical guidance. The gradient for these is shown at the right side of the profile view. Here for runway 21 at Maniwaki, it's 3.6 degrees. This approach has both LNAV and LPV lines of minimums, so as long as the WAS integrity is met, you will have approved not just advisory vertical guidance to the LPV decision height. But because that slope exceeds the limit for LNAV data, the CDF table is blank. The method I've been describing can still be useful to pick your top of descent height, either for ILS or LPV. Here at Maniwaki, you won't be vectored to final at an assigned altitude. After you're cleared for the approach, you'll be on your own. Using the next steeper easy math slope above 3.6 degrees, I'll use 400 feet per mile, 3.8 degrees, to work out my top of descent. The 2 mile distance would be 5.9 miles, giving a descent of 6 times 400 or 2,400 feet. Adding the threshold clearance height of about 600 feet gives a top of descent of 3,000 feet at 6 miles. I'll extend that to 3,400 feet and 7 miles to get a single stage descent. That fairly steep descent will require an inch or so less manifold pressure than a standard rate descent. In a radar environment, you'll intercept final at a barometric altitude assigned by the controller. Some controllers are inclined to vector you very close or even above the glide slope on an ILS. So make sure you have the up-down needle in view before you intercept the localizer. This approach is typical of many in the mountains. Although it's aligned with the runway, the descent would be just too steep for IMC. A quick look at the leg from the step-down fix of Picton to the runway shows that we need to lose 3,300 feet in 4 miles to land straight in. That's 825 feet per mile. Too steep for IMC. That's why it's a circling approach. But we can still use continuous techniques to get to circling minimums. To get down as soon as possible after Picton, let's work with a slope of 400 feet per mile. The height loss between Picton and the MDA is 4,500 minus 3,240, about 1,300 feet. At 400 feet per mile, that will take 3.3 miles. So we'd be visual at circling minimums a bit under a mile back from the airport. This slope would cross Rotka 800 feet above the 4,500 step-down minimum at Picton, so that would be 5,300. That's right on minimums. The minimum height at which a transition lets us join final is 6,500, so our top of descent has to be 1,200 higher, or another 3 miles back. So if we use a top of descent of 6,500 feet, 3 miles back from Rotka, we'll have a continuous descent to circling minimums about a mile before the runway. The next 3 slides are intended to show you some of the differences when using US charts for descent planning. They are certainly not intended as a comprehensive guide to flying Rnav procedures south of the border. In the US, there's never a CDFA table. You usually get vertical guidance, advisory, or approved. If it's an LPV, like the Rnav approach to runway 23 at Saranac Lake here, The gradient is shown beside the profile view, much like in Canada. Here it's 3.2 degrees. In a radar environment, you will usually intercept the final approach course on a vector at an assigned altitude, then follow the needle down. Outside of radar coverage, you can use the way we previously discussed to pick your top of descent. Here, the lowest transition altitude is 5,500 feet. Where will that intercept the glide path? We have about 3,800 feet to lose, so using our closest easy math gradient of 1,000 feet per 3 miles, that will require 11.4 miles. The FAF is at 6.1 miles, so 5.3 miles before the FAF. The 3.2 degree slope will be a little later. So our top of descent is 5,500 feet, soon after John. Do your checks during the transition. When there's no LPV line of minimums, the vertical descent angle, or VDA, may be shown. If it is, it will be placed, quote, following the fix on which it is based, unquote, as shown here for the Rnav runway 09 approach at Saranac Lake. That might have been the step-down fix, but not here. If there is advisory vertical guidance, it will match this slope. Again, the only thing we need to work out is our top of descent. At 3 miles per 1,000 feet, that's 9.6 miles, which puts us 2.1 miles inside RNNDY, which is at 11.7 miles. Not as tight as the last one, though in this case the 3-degree intercept will be a little later. When the vertical descent angle is not specified, it means that, quote, the prescribed obstacle clearance is not clear and the VDA must not be used below the minimum descent altitude, unquote. Using the absence of information to convey information is kind of cryptic, but there's also a note about obstacles in the visual segment above the profile view. I wonder if this is perhaps also one of NavCanada's criteria for leaving the CDFA table blank. Anyway, so much for the visual portion. What do we do about the part of the approach above the MDA? We have to see which fix sets the slope. In this example, the Rnav approach to runway 23 at Messina, New York, when we do the math, it's neckic, and the slope will be right on 320 feet per mile, or 3 degrees. You can use the easy math 3.1 degree approximation to work out the top of descent. At the minimum transition altitude of 2,500, it's 2.3 miles before the FAF. If you get advisory vertical guidance, it'll be a little earlier. In the US, they often use a holding pattern as a transition. It can also serve to execute a course reversal. The Navigator will give you the option of flying a hold. You'd fly it, for example, if you're inbound from the west to the Rnav 23 at Messina. You can practice this particular part without leaving Canadian airspace. For my last unusual approach, I'm going to discuss that particularly evil example of a Canadian traditional aids approach that I promised to look at earlier, the Localizer 2.6 approach at Billy Bishop. It happens to be the only approach from the east to one of Canada's busiest runways, so that's why lots of pilots may find they want to fly it. It's not clear, by the way, why it's not a Localizer DME, since all the fixes are defined by DME. The CDFA table is blank. It's easy to see why. The threshold clearance height is around 300 feet, and there's a step-down fix from 1220 at 2.3 miles. So 920 feet in 2.3 miles. That works out at exactly 400 feet per mile, well over NavCanada's 3.5 degrees. The problem is a stack that towers to 952 feet at the east end of the harbour. Even 400 feet per mile clears the stack by only 300 feet. That leaves me feeling uncomfortable, so I'll opt for the steeper 500 feet per mile gradient. At Zydek, it will be 300 plus 500 times 2.3, or 1450. At Rabix, the FAF, the slope height will be 300 plus 500 times 3.3, or 1950. The 5-mile top of descent will be 2800. You have to check your GSL against these calculated heights as you approach each waypoint. However, once you're on final, if you switch the CDI to VLOC and have your GPS on terrain to see your GSL, you will have lost your distance to the next waypoint information, since the CDI is no longer being driven by the GPS. At least on my Aspen primary flight display, I can get it back by switching pointer number 1 to GPS 1. Then I see it in the bottom left-hand corner of the CDI. This same action is required for any approach where you switch the CDI to VLOC, for example, an ILS or a VORDME. These steep approaches can be flown in IMC, at least in my airplane, but do practice them in VMC before you try it in weather. A stabilized approach is certainly preferable to dive and drive, especially when the step downs are this close to the obstructions. In closing, here are some suggestions about flying the missed approach with the GPS Navigator. When you're flying CDFA, you're required to go missed when you reach your minimum descent altitude. When you make the decision to go missed, most autopilots advise you to switch them off briefly. This is particularly important if you're doing a coupled descent, as it could take you below minimums. Some of the new autopilots have a takeoff go-around toga button, which commands a pitch up and wings level. All you have to do is add power, but you still have to return to GPS guidance. This example is the ILS 08 at North Bay, so you'll be in VLOC mode. As soon as possible after initiating the missed approach, switch the CDI to GPS, as the Localizer guidance gets erratic after the missed approach point. Once you're established in the climb, you can turn the autopilot back on in nav mode. Waypoint sequencing will be suspended at the missed approach point, but the GPS will continue guiding you down the center line. This suspend feature does not apply to the 600-700 with a toga autopilot. At this point, there's a marked difference between the 400-500 series and the 600-700. Note the flight plans. On the 600-700 at the right, there's an extra heading 077 to 2700 leg after runway 08. That's because it's able to fly heading to altitude legs. The 400-500 can't do that. You have to manage the climb straight ahead to 2700 manually. On the 600-700, you can unsuspend by pressing OBS as soon as sequencing is suspended. On the 400-500, you keep it in suspend until you reach 2700. Then you press OBS, the leg to YYB becomes active, and it starts an immediate turn towards the missed approach holding fix. I hope you've learned something from this discussion of continuous descent on final approach. Before it was introduced, I was flying a sort of modified dive and drive, where the rate of dive was related to the distance I had to get down to the next step down fix. But it was by no means a stabilised descent. Now I'm firmly convinced that CDFA is the way to go. I can't imagine being comfortable flying that Localizer 2.6 approach at Billy Bishop if I was starting a dive on 3 Mile Final from 1500 feet with a 952 foot stack a mile ahead. Until next time, blue skies and tailwinds.